I want to show you or talk to you really about what's going on in the atheist mind and how you can have a couple questions, you can very effectively communicate with an atheist and win any debate you have with an atheist, okay? You will win every debate, okay? So I'm sure you guys all came ready to take notes. Okay, mental notes it is. All righty.
You were doing all right till you started lying.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm JL, and this is Bridge the Divide, where I examine irrational beliefs, the irrational behaviors that often follow, and how we, with education, rationality, and reason, can bridge the societal divides that they create. Today, we're going to dive into a series of videos that explore the warped reality of Christian apologist con man Kent Hovind. Eric is, of course, the estranged spawn of inmate number 06452-017, aka creationist con man Kent Hovind. So let's dive in and see what, if anything, Eric brings to the table and just how far the rotten apple falls from the diseased tree.
One of my big struggles is the number of churches and seminaries that are embracing God and evolution.
While I know it is a constant and brutal struggle for creationists to accept reality for what it is instead of what they wish it was, the reason this is happening, Eric, is because it is becoming increasingly understood by the general populace that the concept of a creator God and the demonstrable truth of the theory of evolution are in fact not mutually exclusive concepts. An unfalsifiable creator deity could still exist, and abiogenesis/evolution could very well be the natural non-reality violating means by which that entity created and diversified life on this planet. And this is supported by, first, there being no logical contradiction in the Bible simply being an ancient collection of human misrepresentations and misinterpretations about reality. Second, the claim that there is no logical contradiction cannot be demonstrated to be true without committing a wide range of logical fallacies. And lastly, that the reconciliation of these two concepts being not mutually exclusive actually reduces the number of assumptions that we have to make about reality and is more internally consistent with the available evidence. But ultimately, what Eric has to reconcile is that there is no logical contradiction entailed by this proposition. Unless, of course, he chooses in his dishonesty to redefine specific terms in order to keep his position alive. Unfortunately, myopic fundamentalists like Eric here have been indoctrinated since childhood to believe that any proposition that falls outside of the realm of their religious ideology, regardless of the evidence, is fundamentally impossible. Fortunately for our shared society, more and more Christians are rejecting this level of extreme willful ignorance, intellectual dishonesty, and more importantly, the moral monstrosity of a God it logically leads to. Because the fewer people that believe in that atrocious human concept, the fewer atrocities that will be committed in its name.
I don't know if you're familiar with this, but I just saw this video last week. Andy Stanley is now embracing the evolution worldview.
For those unfamiliar, Andy Stanley is the founder and senior pastor of North Point Ministries, which is a non-denominational evangelical church located in Georgia. Andy, and by extension his congregation, have come under increasing fire from some of the more extreme fundamentalist Christian groups for not only their acknowledgement and acceptance of actual evidence, but also for their position of inclusivity regarding the LGBTQ+ Christian community, who Andy views as instrumental to his faith. And while fundy blowhards like Ray Comfort, John MacArthur, Kent Hovind, and his spawn here will often rail that Andy's position ultimately harms the church, what they really mean is that Andy's position of inclusivity actually harms their own ministries by drawing away tithing congregation members who are sick and tired of their decisive and hateful rhetoric.
Saying that evolution is the means, theism is the agent.
Yeah, that's actually a really good way for Andy to sum that up. It's consistent with the evidence, it presents no logical contradiction, and it actually reduces the number of assumptions you have to make about the nature of this entity in order to reconcile that the two concepts are not mutually exclusive. And even though I'm an atheist, I will take intellectually honest and inclusive preachers being a force for good in their community over fundy, hate-spewing fearmongers any day of the week.
Man, this is a very prominent, very high-profile pastor who is now publicly okay with embracing evolution and creation together.
Andy has become pretty high profile over the years. In fact, back in 2017, a survey of U.S. pastors in Outreach magazine identified him as one of the 10 most influential living pastors in America. And one of the reasons he gets that praise is because he is intellectually honest regarding what is actually evidence and what is not. It's a trait that allows him and his congregation to focus more on the positive community aspects of Christianity while simultaneously eschewing much of the ignorant divisiveness it often results in. And even though his God doesn't actually exist, that really doesn't matter, because as the evidence indicates, Andy is doing everything he can to be a force for positivity and inclusivity in this world. And on a more personal note, if someone decides to go into the world and dedicate their time, money, and energy into being a force for positive change, like eliminating ignorance, elevating reason, respecting identities and boundaries, instead of a force for division that rips communities apart with fear and ignorance and bigotry, it really shouldn't matter how they justify that. So the real question then becomes, if the members of Andy's congregation are happy, healthy, inclusive, intellectually honest, and productive members of society, which seems to me to be in fair keeping with the doctrines of their corpse god, then why exactly would weirdos like Eric Hovind here have such a personal problem with that?
You can't take both sides. That just doesn't work.
Then why not, Eric? Your claim is that the two concepts are mutually exclusive, meaning they cannot both be true. But you can't back that up unless you can show the logical contradiction entailed therein. As we always say, the burden of proof is upon the claimant, which means it is on you to back that up with evidence. And I will straight up tell you, you can't.
You can't take the God side and the evolution side, because the whole point is they don't go together.
You're just repeating the claim, Eric, and you also failed to point out the logical contradiction that you seem to think exists here. I wonder why that is. Let's move on to the next video.
The rate at which students are rejecting God and rejecting the Bible, it is unprecedented.
True, Christianity has been on a downward trend in the United States over the past 3 decades. Every day, thanks to that beautiful tool we call the internet, more and more people have access to the critical information that once upon a time their religious leaders didn't want them to have. And when you come to understand that the Bible itself instructs churches like Hovind's here to condemn critical inquiry and glorify ignorance, you can easily see why Hovind and his dishonest ilk are freaking out right now.
It's a problem, but a proper education in science and in scripture is essential to overcoming the challenges of a skeptical world.
Well, one could argue that an appropriate education in science, coupled with an understanding of the Bible that makes no unnecessary or unjustified assumptions, is why more and more Christians are abandoning the Bible as a source of truth, just as easily as they would abandon the Quran, the Vedas, the Bhagavad Gita, or any other holy text that they already don't believe in. And in regards to any challenges presented by a skeptical world, that's what a rigorous scientific methodology is for determining the best explanation for a particular phenomenon based upon already established facts. Such a rigorous methodology results in novel predictions which sufficiently inform us as to what is actually the case concerning reality, something Eric's asserted God seems to be fundamentally incapable of. Let's move on to the third video.
A plan in place for over 100 years to use the education system to systematically change the way future generations think.
Well, that's a weird way of looking at it, but I would agree. And that's because it's widely understood that it is not the job of educators to teach their charges what to think, but instead how to think. Meaning specifically, how to ask questions, how to critically analyze evidence, how to eliminate their bias, how to not assume truth, and how to derive appropriate conclusions given the available evidence. The fact that this rigorous method of education invariably exposes your God to be an absolutely insufficient explanatory hypothesis is certainly not the fault of science. In fact, if your God were to actually exist, the onus for this problem would actually be on it for creating a reality where this happens to be the the case and then turning around and demanding differently.
Double standard!
If this entity actually wanted people to believe in it with critical and intellectual honesty, then in its omniscience, it would have already known that some legitimate evidence would go a long way to achieving that goal. Which logically demands the question, if this entity omnisciently knew that fact before it created anything, then why wouldn't it ensure that that evidence was available at any time from the jump?
It has been a means of social programming.
That's just flatly dishonest. If modern educators were legitimately attempting to program their students, then teaching them to seek truth by always asking questions, which is literally the fundamental basis of all of science, would actually run counter to a programmed message about what is or is not true. What Eric is actually doing is describing Christian indoctrination and then dishonestly projecting it upon the public education system. He does this because first, he believes that any education program that does not start with the existence of his God as a fact is therefore automatically programming students to believe that that God does not exist. And secondly, because Eric legitimately believes that his congregants are stupid enough to believe this. What Hovind is asserting here is not only jam-packed full of logical fallacies, but he is also inadvertently exposing the failure of Christian-based education systems by falsely claiming that the public education system utilizes the same teaching methodology that they do.
Now, it has become extremely obvious in recent years that parents are no longer in charge of their child's education in the public schools.
That's correct, and that's because parents, who are also teachers, to varying degrees of success, they are not their children's formal educators. That's why we have teachers who go to college and get formally certified to be trained instructors in their chosen fields. And as far as what public school students are learning specifically in each one of their classrooms, that's determined by the joint efforts of the Federal Department of Education, the local state boards, the districts, and the teachers themselves. Parents still get to voice and exercise their opinions during the various major public meetings that occur throughout the year, but if all the parents, especially the ones of a particular religious slant, were allowed to dictate to teachers what their children learned in the classroom, then we could see not only would that be a violation of the First Amendment, but the entire system would fall into chaos.
That task has been taken over by individuals and corporations who use their money to influence what is being taught to our children.
Citation fucking needed, Eric. Because last I checked, AT&T, Walmart, and Disney did not dictate public grade school curriculums. Public school curriculums are decided by the Department of Education with input from school boards and teacher associations, among others. And because schools are not 501c3s, anytime a school board approves taking money from a private donor or business, by law they must disclose those numbers to the public, because any funds received by a public institution become public funds and are therefore subject to various restrictions. And on a personal note, Eric, this level of conspiratorial thinking is why no one, even your fellow Christians, take you seriously. Let's move on to the next video.
When we are looking at the world and saying we're not going to allow the supernatural to come into the scientific debate, that's a problem.
Well, it's really only a problem for individuals like you who make the ridiculous claims that you make. There is a very specific reason as to why the supernatural has no place in scientific debate. But before we get there, we have to make sure that we're operating with the correct definition of supernatural. Derived from the medieval Latin supernaturalis, the word supernatural refers to those concepts that are considered outside, above, or beyond nature. Essentially, any phenomena that cannot be explained within the full scope of the laws of nature as we understand them would, by definition, be supernatural.
It's certainly not scientific to do so.
Wrong again, Eric. It is entirely scientific. Science, being the tool that we use to explain observed phenomena, does so by repeatedly testing and independently verifying the conclusions that we derive about reality, and then using that information to make novel predictions. So, definitionally, any phenomena that cannot be tested, independently verified, or utilized to make additional predictions about reality, or for that phenomena to be true, would require a total and complete suspension of the laws of reality, such as, say, pretty much every miracle in the Bible, have absolutely no place in scientific debate. Science predicates conclusions based on evidence and testable reality, not things that are internally and subjectively felt to exist outside the scope of nature, which, for the record, is itself a state of being that cannot be demonstrated to actually exist outside of pure conjecture. If such phenomena could be repeatedly tested, independently verified, and used to make novel predictions about reality, then by definition they would no longer be supernatural. This is why the supernatural is rejected, because if it wasn't, then anyone could just come along and propose anything that they personally desire to be an explanation.
I had a cold a couple years ago. I went in there. You know what he said to me? He goes, "Oh, you need an ear nail." A nail in my fucking ear.
And scientific inquiry, explanation, and advancement would completely cease.
And they'll argue, well, science can only deal with the natural world. I get it.
Exactly. And if you truly get it, then why do you think it's a problem?
But then you need to stick with just the natural world.
We do. Scientists in their fields do not derive conclusions about things that cannot be demonstrated to exist or things that they don't have observational or measurable access to. If science is really good at one thing at least, it's staying in its lane, something creationists like you, Eric, seem to have a real problem with.
And you need to stop trying to explain how things came into the natural world.
Well, that just makes no sense at all. Just because science doesn't fully understand or is currently unable to fully explain a particular phenomena does not logically entail that the explanation for that phenomena is supernatural. And scientists are certainly not going to assume that to be an explanation, so it absolutely becomes the job of scientists in a particular field to work towards a natural explanation for any phenomena. And this includes things like evolution, gravity, Big Bang cosmology, and abiogenesis. Now, Eric, if you legitimately believe that a natural explanation for this universe is impossible, then all you have to do is demonstrate how this universe that we persist in could only exist with God magic, and then claim your Nobel Prize. But until that time comes, everything you've asserted, Eric, is completely baseless and predicated only on the narcissistic notion that you are somehow special in all the universe. Spoiler alert. You are not.
And you now, if you're just going to stick with the natural world, you now can't explain things like logic and morality and the very science that you're using.
That is also demonstrably false. Logic is descriptive, not prescriptive of the universe, and the classical laws are affirmed by their negation, meaning that for the universe itself to be coherent, they can't not be true. As for morality, moral action is completely subjective to the individual, as are the moral frameworks that we collectively agree to live by as a society. We do, however, know that the human sense of what we've arbitrarily defined as morality is deeply rooted in our evolution. Our evolved sense of empathy allowed us as a social species the cognitive ability to establish these moral frameworks that further ensured we didn't openly slaughter ourselves into extinction. And science itself is just the tool that we use to explain that phenomena. Over the past 6,000 years, human beings have painstakingly developed rigorous and strict methodologies for determining those explanations. Eric's claim here is just flatly wrong because he is as scientifically illiterate and ignorant as he is philosophically bankrupt.
Science, the laws of science, are not material in nature.
Correct, and we don't claim them to be because what we call the scientific laws merely describe what we observe. Now, if you want to make an additional claim in regards to the laws of nature themselves, feel free to do so. Just make sure you have the evidence to back that claim up.
They'll say, well, they're just a product of the universe.
I have never heard anyone literate in these fields say that the laws of science are a product of anything, especially not the universe. Because, as I said, what we refer to as the laws of science or the laws of nature are simply human articulated descriptions of what we observe. And we use those descriptions to make additional predictions about reality. And when those predictions come true, indicates that how we've defined what we initially observed is accurate. Remember, Eric, scientific laws describe what happens under certain circumstances, and scientific theories explain why it happens. There is a world of difference.
Why? You're just saying that. We've got to move beyond Darwinian evolution.
It always comes back to Darwin with these fools, but that's simply because they refuse to embrace all of the remarkable advancements that evolutionary biologists have made in the last century. And that's because if they were to be intellectually honest and do that, then they'd realize that they don't have a leg to stand on. They are, of course, ideologically bound to keep their thinking grounded in the ignorant past because that is the only place it still makes sense. So before Eric gets the chance to start running his mouth about pseudoscientific bullshit like social Darwinism, let's move on to the last video.
In your heart, you know that there is a God, that this world was made.
This is Chris Ashcraft. He's a friend of Eric Hovind, he's a Christian apologist, and he's the founder of Northwest Creation Network and creationwiki.org. Educationally speaking, Chris has a background in plant science, but in regards to the topics that Eric Hovind usually brings up, I can't find a single published academic or peer-reviewed paper from him anywhere. The only work of his that I could actually find appears only on his own personal creationist platforms. Currently, he teaches biology, chemistry, human anatomy and physiology, and creation apologetics at Cedar Park Christian Schools in Washington State. And to answer his claim that in my heart, or that I feel that there is actually a God and that this world was made by it, a claim, by the way, that he's deriving from Romans 1:19 through 20, the answer is, of course, an absolute no. Fun fact, sometimes external stimuli can elicit powerful emotional responses in human beings. For example, joy, love, sex, fear, and anger. When this phenomena occurs, the brain triggers the release of various hormones which can have an intense effect on one's blood pressure and heart rate. And this particular phenomena is precisely why ignorant human beings first started associating feelings with the heart. So, when the Bible says that people know it in their heart, what it actually means is that people feel it to be true. They were referring to our emotions, which consequentially are also handled in the brain, they just were ignorant of that fact at the time. And also, not only do I not feel like this universe was created by a mind, I certainly do not possess the knowledge that it was. In fact, depending upon the logical entailments or the evidence, I can actually eliminate many asserted gods from the possibility of being a creator deity, including the Christian Abrahamic God.
You're not God.
Yes, I am, Jesus!
And until such an entity, or a mechanism of instantiation that necessitates such an entity, can be demonstrated to exist, there is zero justification in making that claim and then presenting that claim as if it were absolute truth. Oh, and on another personal note, one of the major reasons why atheists really don't take apologists very seriously is because apologists are constantly in the habit of accusing us of lying to ourselves and then having the gall to tell us what we believe. However, as annoying as it is, it does serve the purpose of exposing them for the pretentious narcissistic assholes that they actually are.
So why do they choose evolution? I believe it's a conscious choice.
No, beliefs are not choices, they are what we are convinced of. And evolution is an observed and undisputed fact of reality. So we don't choose to believe in evolution, we believe it because it's been demonstrated to be true, just like you don't choose to believe in gravity or the germ theory of disease. We are convinced of its truth because it has been demonstrated to be true, because of the literal mountains of evidence and repeatable tests and novel predictions that support the theory.
I think it's just something that people want to believe. They want to believe that there is no God.
No matter how ignorant or deceptive it may be, you are entitled to your opinion, Chris. But you are again 100% wrong. If such an entity actually existed, then science would absolutely want to know that. Because simply knowing that it existed for a fact would lead us to a more accurate understanding of reality. Pulling again from the book of Romans, Chris is making this claim based on the erroneous idea that people just don't want to follow God's rules. Because they're just so fucking in love with their sin. But that's not how science works. Science itself does not care what people feel about a particular thing or even how they act on those feelings. And as a further note, if a God were to actually be demonstrated to exist, it does not logically follow that everyone on the planet would suddenly become a Christian. It would only mean that logically there could be no more atheists, but the entity's worthiness of worship is an entirely separate claim.
They want to believe that they're just another animal because In a way, it's a more comfortable way to live.
No, acknowledging that we're just evolved animals on the planet is just acknowledging reality. Existence of a god or not, human beings still have a whole mess of issues that they have to deal with, from personal all the way to global. The only reason believing in a god would make things easier on people is because the existence of such an entity by nature would alleviate human beings of much of their responsibilities to their fellow humans. But because an entity like the Christian Abrahamic God does not and cannot exist, that means 100% of the responsibilities for our actions and inactions fall squarely on us. The evil that we encounter in the world ceases to be reduced to a perfunctory moral lesson or a weird metaphysical personification of some god's mysterious goodness. The victims of that evil also cease to be reduced to mere object lessons for others or reminders that serve only to validate the feelings of others. Each of these things becomes the direct responsibility of all of us humans. Justice becomes our responsibility. There's no God to answer scary questions, reconcile what confuses us, assuage us when we're frightened, or to relinquish the reins of control over our own lives to when we happen to feel helpless or have convinced ourselves that we are incapable of helping our own situations or others improve, or even worse, to scapegoat for the tragedies that occur in the world. Which pretty much means that when you put it all together, being an atheist requires greater psychological and emotional fortitude than a God worldview ever could.
It's terrifying to live with the thought that there is an almighty God that has made us and that we will stand before in judgment someday.
No, it actually isn't, especially when that entity is by nature a capricious moral monster that is unworthy of worship. Were such an entity to exist and send me to hell based solely upon the fact that I logically and honestly came to the conclusion that by the evidence it doesn't exist, then I would stride backwards into hell, fingers in the air, knowing full well that I possessed the moral high ground over what basically amounted to a cosmic bully.
That's a terrifying way to live, and people don't want to face that. So they just choose to believe in evolution instead.
Like I said, Chris here is being completely dishonest in his representation of why people accept evolution. In fact, many Christians have long since reconciled the truth of evolution with the God that they feel exists. And that's because, as I stated at the beginning, these two concepts are not mutually exclusive. It's not about being afraid, Chris. It's about not being afraid to be intellectually honest concerning reality.
Even though there's evidence that this world was made out there, they just choose to believe that they're just an animal.
Evidence that this universe and humans were made by some entity. Please present this evidence at your earliest convenience. In fact, why don't you take that evidence, go and get it peer-reviewed, and then have it published for all the world to see. I promise that I will be front row center when they hand you your Nobel Prize.
I think it's just a conscious choice that they're making.
Well, it's not a conscious choice, because beliefs are what we're convinced of, not something we actively choose. I'd strongly recommend that both Chris and Eric look up doxastic involuntarism for further reference. So this will conclude part 1 of my look at the atrocious argumentation and general ignorance of Eric Hovind and his goofy friends. Stay tuned for part 2 when we will hear more fallacious argumentation, meet more members of Eric's narcissistic inner circle, and see just how far the rotten apple falls from the diseased tree that produced it. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please like, share, and subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications. And be sure to leave a comment below. I love reading your responses, and those interactions help with the dreaded algorithm. Don't forget, July is National Minority Mental Health Awareness Month. A link on how you can support these important efforts is down in the description. And if you love scary movies, be sure to check out me and my filmmaker friends over at the Week in Horror podcast, now in our 4th season. Everything you need to become a channel member here, get yourself some official Bridge the Divide gear, support the podcast, or even get your own Darth, Dawkins Squeak toy is down in the description below. Once again, thank you all so much for your continued support, and as always, be safe, be excellent to each other, and together, we can bridge the divide.